This is what happens when you confuse following protocol with actual clinical thinking. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 6 minutes before a Black Hawk helicopter landed in his parking lot and ended his career. St. Michael's Hospital in San Diego smells like industrial antiseptic and burnt coffee, fluorescent lights buzzing over linoleum floors cold enough to feel through shoes. The morning shift begins at 0600, and Brooke Sullivan is already on the 4th floor medical wing, checking for lines with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory no nursing school can teach. Her hands move through the work with fluid efficiency, adjusting drip rates, scanning monitors, noting vitals in patient charts, each movement economical, purposeful, the way someone handles equipment when lives depend on it. She has worked at St. Michael's for 3 years. In that time, she has become expertly invisible. The hospital badge clipped to her scrubs reads B. Sullivan, RN in white lettering on a blue background. Nothing about the badge indicates rank, clearance level, or the fact that her official military record was classified, redacted, and buried so deep that even the Pentagon's primary database shows her as deceased. Marja, Afghanistan. 2009 to 2015. 6 years. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. A kill count she does not think about before dawn. A Navy Cross locked in a safe deposit box she has never mentioned to anyone. In her locker downstairs, beneath her spare scrubs and a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen, sit a pair of worn combat boots. The leather is cracked in specific patterns, sand scars, blood stains faded to rust, a small tear near the left heel where shrapnel caught it and didn't go through. The boots are the only physical evidence she has not learned to hide. They sit in the shadows of the locker, and every shift, she walks past them as if they belong to someone else. Brooke finishes checking before on room for 14, a post-op patient from yesterday's appendectomy. Vitals stable. The bag hangs at the correct height. She makes a note in the chart and moves to the next patient without acknowledging the resident standing 3 feet away, a young woman named Chen who watches Brooke's work the way people watch something they do not understand but recognize as important. Brooke has learned not to make eye contact. Eye contact invites questions. Questions invite explanations. Explanations invite scrutiny. At 06:07, Dr. Whitfield arrives for grand rounds. He walks the corridor with the gait of someone who believes the space rearranges itself for his benefit, his white coat fluttering slightly as he moves, residents trailing behind him in orbit like planets around a star that radiates heat but no light. There are 6 residents this morning. 2 medical students. 1 attending physician from another service. And Brooke, standing at the medication cart on the 4th floor, preparing for antibiotics for the patient in 416. Dr. Whitfield stops at room 412. He does not acknowledge Brooke. He has never acknowledged Brooke. This patient presented with what? He asks one of the residents, a tall man named Martinez who straightens immediately. Acute coronary syndrome. Troponin elevated. EKG showed ST elevation in the anterior distribution, Martinez answers. And the treatment protocol? Dual antiplatelet therapy. Aspirin and clopidogrel. Then cardiac catheterization for revascularization. Brooke does not look up from her work. She draws up the ceftriaxone into the syringe, steady hands, her jaw a single clean line of muscle. She is aware of Dr. Whitfield the way prey is aware of predators, not by watching, but by feeling the change in air pressure when something dangerous enters the space. Correct, Whitfield says, and then he turns. His eyes land on Brooke as if she is a stain on the wall that has suddenly become relevant to his morning. He does not speak to her. Instead, he speaks about her, his voice pitched loud enough that every resident, every medical student, everyone in a 30-foot radius hears what comes next. This is what happens when you confuse following protocol with actual clinical thinking, he says, gesturing vaguely in her direction. Protocol is a crutch for nurses who lack the intellectual capacity to adapt to complex clinical situations. It is the difference between someone who follows orders and someone who understands medicine. He pauses. He lets that sink in. When a patient needs care, protocol is not enough. Protocol is what people follow when they lack the ability to think critically. Notice how Nurse Sullivan simply checks boxes, executes tasks assigned by doctors. That is protocol. That is the ceiling of nursing, execution without innovation. Without understanding. Brooke does not move. Her hands do not tremble. Her face does not flush. She finishes drawing up the antibiotic, depresses the plunger slightly to check for air, then places the syringe on the medication cart with the kind of deliberate control that suggests her hands might have other capabilities if she allowed them to surface. She can feel Dr. Whitfield watching to see if she will react. Watching to see if she will speak. Watching to see if she will crumble the way he has watched 37 other nurses crumble over his 17-year tenure at St. Michael's. What he sees instead is a jaw that clenches once, a sharp tightening of muscle along her lower face, and then complete stillness. Her eyes stay on the medication cart. Her shoulders remain level. Her breathing does not change. She is a wall. Except walls have no history. Walls have no scars. Walls have never been to a place called Marja and come back fundamentally altered in ways that civilian medicine cannot repair. The resident Chen watches this exchange. She watches Whitfield speak about Brooke as if Brooke is not a human being standing 6 feet away. She watches Brooke receive the humiliation without flinching, without defending herself, without looking up from her work. And something in Chen's face shifts, confusion, maybe, or the beginning of understanding that this quiet nurse might be operating on a different frequency than everyone assumed. Whitfield moves on to the next patient. His voice rises again, and the residents orbit him, and the moment passes, and Brooke finishes her medication preparation and walks to room 416 where an elderly woman is waiting for her for antibiotics. She does not look in a mirror. She does not retreat to a supply closet. She does not text anyone. She simply places the 4-line, one careful stick, thread the catheter, secure it with gauze and tape, and pushes the antibiotic slowly into the port while the patient talks about her grandchildren and her garden and the surgery that has left her feeling like her body is no longer quite her own. "You'll feel better soon," Brooke says, her voice the same as always, steady, professional, kind in a way that Whitfield would probably categorize as protocol. What he could not know was that the steadiness in her voice came from the same place the muscle memory came from. From Marja. From a compound that no longer exists on any official map. From a unit that was dissolved and erased and redacted so thoroughly that half the people who served in it are listed as casualties even though they walk through civilian hospitals now, checking for lines, maintaining their invisibility, trying to remember what it feels like to be human. She had operated in places where call sign was the only name that mattered. Where her role was not to follow protocol but to adapt to situations where the protocol had been written in blood and required split-second decisions that had nothing to do with nursing school and everything to do with knowing how to keep people alive when everything else was trying to kill them. But that wasn't the worst part of what Whitfield had done. The worst part was that he had no idea. He had no idea that the nurse he had just humiliated in front of 6 residents had performed emergency pericardiocentesis in a place called Sanjin Valley while artillery whispered overhead. He had no idea that her hands had held sinus rhythm when it was slipping away, that her eyes had tracked pupils and SpO2 and capillary refill in locations where blood type might not be available and decisions about who lived and who did not were hers alone to make. He had no idea that the worst part of being erased is that you still remember everything. Brooke finishes with the patient in 416 and moves to 417. The day continues. Monitors beep their steady rhythm. The 4 drips hiss their liquid precision. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead like insects trapped in plastic. By 0700, the humiliation is already fading in real time, replaced by the work, replaced by the next patient, replaced by the structure of protocol that Whitfield had dismissed without understanding that protocol is sometimes the thing that keeps you standing when you no longer remember how to be anything else. But 6 minutes. That is how long it takes for everything to change. The vending machine hummed its mechanical dirge as Brooke fed her $2 bills into the slot, watching them disappear into the mechanism with the same resigned expression she'd perfected over 3 years at St. Michael's. The coffee clattered down, and she reached for it, her fingers closing around the warm paper cup with surgical precision. Behind her, Dr. Whitfield's voice carried across the staff lounge like an announcement made for her benefit and hers alone. Do you think someone with Sullivan's limited credentials should even have medication access? His words hung in the recycled hospital air, directed at his colleague but shaped entirely for Brooke's ears. I've seen her charting. Barely literate. The kind of thinking that creates liability. Her jaw clenched. A single muscle flickered beneath her ear like a fish trapped under skin. Then nothing. Absolute stillness. She lifted the cup, took a measured sip, and turned from the machine without acknowledging he'd spoken at all. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she passed within 2 feet of him, her eyes fixed on a point beyond his shoulder, her face a mask of such perfect neutrality it took more discipline than most people could muster in a lifetime of meditation. Whitfield watched her go, irritated by her refusal to react. Lesser people would have defended themselves. Lesser people would have let the shame bloom red across their cheeks. But Brooke Sullivan simply walked out as if he were part of the furniture, and that indifference infuriated him more than any argument could have. She made it to the corridor before her breath steadied, before the controlled rhythm reasserted itself, the one she'd learned in places that didn't exist on any map. The one that had kept her alive when the alternative was panic and the panic meant death. She held the coffee cup and moved through St. Michael's like a ghost, invisible and precise. The next encounter came 4 hours later at the nurse's station. Post-op patient in room for 12, discharged order printed and signed by Whitfield himself, but the vitals weren't tracking right. Temperature 99.4 and climbing. Heart rate 112. Blood pressure 94/58 and drifting downward. The confusion had started an hour ago, the patient asking where his wife was despite her sitting right there holding his hand. Brooke pulled the chart and found Whitfield reviewing imaging studies at the desk. Dr. Whitfield, the post-op in 412 is showing early sepsis indicators. Temperature curve, tachycardia, dropping BP, and altered mental status. Before we discharge, shouldn't we run a lactate and consider antibiotics? The room went quiet in the way rooms do when someone has just violated an unspoken hierarchy. Whitfield didn't look up from the monitor. When he finally turned to face her, his expression had crystallized into something that reminded her of predators she'd seen in photographs, perfectly still, perfectly controlled, and absolutely dangerous. You are a nurse, Sullivan, not a diagnostic Ian. His voice remained level, but the words came out like punctuation marks in a sentence written in ice. Question my clinical judgment again and I will have security escort you out of this hospital for insubordination. Do you understand me? His finger came up, pointing inches from her face, a gesture designed to humiliate, to establish dominance, to force submission through proximity and performance. Brooke looked at him with eyes that showed absolutely nothing, no fear, no anger, no wounded pride, no human reaction at all. Just empty observation, the way one might regard a piece of equipment that wasn't working correctly. Understood, doctor, she said, her voice flat as concrete and twice as immovable. She turned back to her station and continued working as if the exchange had never happened, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same mechanical precision as before. But that night, alone in the supply closet during the 2100 to 2300 stock rotation, her hands gave her away. They gripped the metal shelf until her knuckles blanched white, the copper taste of blood flooding her mouth because she'd bitten the inside of her cheek hard enough to draw it. Her breath came in measured counts learned in places where panic was a bullet you fired at yourself, for in, for out, for in, for out, the pattern an anchor, the rhythm a raft in an ocean that wanted to drown her. What they didn't know was that she'd already been erased once. Already been buried under classification markings and redacted documents. Already spent years learning to be invisible, and invisibility had its own particular kind of violence. The Army Ranger arrived in the ER on a Wednesday evening at 1847 hours, limping through the automatic doors with his right forearm wrapped in a field dressing that was already bleeding through. Staff Sergeant Chen, according to his driver's license, the name tag on his PT uniform reading Chen with a Ranger tab sewn beneath it and the tan leather insignia of 75th Ranger Regiment. Training accident at Camp Pendleton. The knife had caught him during a CQC demonstration, the blade sliding across the anterior forearm in a gash that needed at least 30 stitches and possibly a hand surgeon consult depending on what lay beneath the surface. Brooke was assigned to assist in the laceration closure, and she suited up with the economical movements of someone who'd done this before, not in clinics, not in training centers with clean conditions and perfect lighting, but in actual field conditions where blood on your hands meant something immediate and irreversible. She prepped the wound with chlorhexidine, her movements economical and practiced, the kind of efficiency that came from having done this on Marines and soldiers and Navy personnel in environments where infection was a guaranteed outcome and time was measured in seconds instead of minutes. She laid out the suture kit, selected a 4.0 monofilament with a curved needle, and began the closure. The vertical mattress technique she chose was specific. The needle angle was wrong for civilian training protocols, too acute, the spacing too precise, the tension pattern designed for field conditions where the wound would be subjected to salt water or sand or the particular kind of contamination that came from being treated under a torp or behind a wall. Halfway through the closure, when she was establishing the pattern that would hold even if infection set in and swelling began, Chen's hand shot out and gripped her wrist. Not aggressive. Urgent. His eyes locked on hers with the intensity of someone who'd just recognized a ghost. "That's a Kandahar vertical mattress," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Where the hell did a civilian nurse learn that? The ER froze. The monitor behind them beeped its steady rhythm. The sound of a stretcher rolling past in the corridor, rubber wheels squeaking against linoleum. Whitfield looked up from his tablet across the room, his expression shifting into something like interest, the way a predator's attention sharpens when it detects movement in tall grass. Brooke met Chen's stare with the same empty expression she'd given Whitfield during the security threat. Her face revealed absolutely nothing, no recognition, no surprise, no acknowledgement that he'd just asked her a question that should have drawn a confession from anyone who was actually what they claimed to be. She gently removed his hand from her wrist with the kind of careful control that suggested she could have removed it without being gentle if she'd wanted to. "You're going to want to hold still," she said, her voice quiet and level. "This part requires precision." She continued the suture pattern without hesitation, the needle making its perpendicular passes, the knots tying off with absolute certainty, each stitch placed exactly where it needed to be for a wound that would be pulled tight by combat gear or a field pack or the simple violence of survival. When she finished, she placed the final knot, trimmed the excess, and documented the procedure with clinical precision. Vertical mattress closure, 4.0 monofilament, tension appropriate, hemostasis achieved, no signs of vascular or nerve involvement. She disposed of the sharps in the biohazard container, the needles disappearing with a metallic clink. She removed her gloves, pulled up the closure on the digital record, and turned to leave. Chen watched her go, his expression troubled, something dancing at the edges of his memory that he couldn't quite place. Something that said, "You were there. I would have recognized you anywhere. How are you breathing and standing?" That night, back in her apartment on Kettle Street, Brooke sat on the edge of her bed staring at the pair of worn combat boots in the back of her closet, the one she'd been explicitly ordered to destroy, the one she couldn't bring herself to burn because they were the only physical evidence that she'd ever existed as anything other than a nurse. The leather was scuffed, the heels worn smooth from thousands of miles, the laces reinforced with black electrical tape because that's what you used in the field when regular laces broke. She didn't sleep. She sat in the dark with the boots in her lap and didn't sleep at all, knowing that something had shifted, that the careful wall she'd constructed between those two lives had developed a crack, and Chen had seen through it. He would ask questions. He would make phone calls to people who still remembered her name in classified briefings. And then everything buried would come walking back out into the light. Thursday morning arrived without fanfare. The hospital corridors at 0720 smelled like they always did, antiseptic layered over stale coffee and the faint copper undertone of blood someone hadn't quite cleaned from the trauma bay tiles. Brooke pushed the vital signs cart toward room 412, her badge clipped at eye level, her scrub still damp at the collar from the pre-dawn shower she'd taken to stop her hands from shaking. Chen had been admitted the night before for observation. Elevated CPK levels from overtraining, mild dehydration, nothing that suggested the morning was about to collapse into something that would reshape the entire institutional hierarchy of St. Michael's. She'd seen his name on the board during shift change. Army Ranger. The notation might as well have been written in blood. She'd made the decision in that moment, routine checks, professional distance, the invisible nurse that Dr. Whitfield had spent 3 years perfecting. In and out. For minutes. Vitals, notation, move to the next patient. The kind of work that left no footprints. The door to 412 was partially open. She pushed it wider with the toe of her shoe, keeping her hands free for the cart. Chen was awake, propped at 30 degrees, his color normal. Good sign. His forearm laceration was clean, the sutures holding, no signs of infection or drainage. The monitors beside the bed showed green numbers, oxygen saturation 98, heart rate 74, blood pressure 118/76. Everything textbook. Everything safe. Morning vitals, she said quietly, moving toward the blood pressure cuff. Her voice had learned to be smaller in front of patients. Softer. A thing that didn't demand attention. Chen nodded, and she began the routine. Cuff inflated. Numbers registered. She was writing the 0720 notation on the chart when something shifted in the room's air pressure. Not obvious. Not loud. Just a microscopic change in oxygen saturation, 96. Then 94. The number dropped like a stone thrown into dark water. She looked at the monitor. Then looked again. His skin had gone the color of wet concrete in the span of 8 seconds. Chen. Not a question. A command. Are you having chest pain? His hand moved to his sternum. His jaw clenched. Can't. Breathe. Fully. The words came out in fragments. She'd heard that speech pattern before. She'd heard it in field hospitals in Marja, in forward operating bases where men lay on stretchers with their chests filling with fluid they couldn't expel. Cardiac tamponade. Blood was accumulating in the pericardial sac, compressing his heart, stealing its ability to pump. The suture line from his laceration repair, something must have nicked deeper than the surgeon's cursory post-op assessment had indicated. Internal bleeding. Silent. Accumulating. Killing him in real time. She hit the code button without hesitation. The alarm shrieked through the hallway. She was already moving toward the crash cart before she'd finished the motion, her hands working on muscle memory that had nothing to do with her nursing school credentials. 0720 admission. Elevated CPK levels. Overtraining. The story was a cover. A filter. Someone was coming to collect on this, and she needed him alive when they arrived. Whitfield was in the room within 90 seconds, which was approximately 80 seconds after Brooke had already determined that 90 seconds would be 80 seconds too late. She watched him take in the monitor readings, blood pressure dropping like an elevator with cut cables, oxygen saturation in the 80s, heart rate climbing toward 150 as the organ struggled against the compression of fluid accumulating around it. His face went white. Actually white. The kind of white that meant every drop of blood had just relocated to his digestive system in preparation for vomiting. "Get the crash cart," Whitfield said. His voice had lost its edge. It had become something smaller, something that recognized it was standing in the presence of a problem it couldn't solve with condescension or rank. "It's here," Brooke said. She was already at the bedside, already assessing the xiphoid process, the anatomical landmark below Chen's sternum where the needle needed to enter the pericardial space. She moved his gown aside. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Pain is information. Blood is data. This was just another equation with a time limit. "Call for pressers," Whitfield said. He was still frozen at the monitor, watching the numbers collapse like a building in controlled demolition. "We need to get him to the cath lab." "Call cardiology." "We'll need a..." Brooke reached for the 18-gauge needle from the crash cart. The plastic wrapper crinkled between her fingers. She didn't ask permission. Permission was what paralyzed people in moments like this, what made them stand at monitors reciting protocols while patients died of problems that had solutions if you were willing to move fast enough to touch them. The needle went in below the xiphoid process, angle directed toward the left shoulder. She felt the slight resistance as it breached the pericardium. Then the give. The sudden relief of pressure against the needle tip as it entered the space where blood was accumulating like water behind a failing dam. Blood came back into the syringe. 60 milliliters in 30 seconds. The pressure relief was immediate. Chen's color shifted. Pink crept back into his cheeks. His breathing deepened. His oxygen saturation climbed, 86, 88, 91, like a plane finally achieving altitude. His heart rate began to stabilize. The monitor's frantic beeping became almost rhythmic. 40 seconds. The entire procedure took 40 seconds. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that could stop time. It was the kind of silence where you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing their electric prayer, where you could hear the ventilator in the next room wheeze through its mechanical cycle, where you could hear Chen's lungs finally drawing air that his heart could actually pump toward his brain. Brooke withdrew the needle and applied pressure with a sterile gauze pad. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't stutter. She was already mentally calculating the paperwork this would generate, the questions that would follow, the institutional protocols she'd just dismantled by doing the right thing instead of waiting for the correct thing. Whitfield's face underwent a transformation that took roughly 3 seconds. It went from white to a shade of red that suggested his blood pressure was climbing toward numbers that would have required their own medical intervention. She could see the moment it happened, the moment he understood what she'd just done. Not called for a crash cart. Not initiated protocols. Performed an emergency pericardiocentesis with the kind of competence that suggested it wasn't the first time her hands had done this particular calculation. Get cardiology, she said quietly, still looking at Chen's chest, still maintaining the perfect posture of a nurse attending to a patient. We need imaging to confirm the bleeding source. She didn't look at Whitfield. Didn't need to. She could feel the weight of his stare like a physical pressure against her back. She could sense the moment his mind began cycling through what this meant. A nurse. Just a nurse. A woman with limited credentials who'd performed a surgical procedure that he'd been trained to do and had failed to attempt because the weight of institutional hierarchy had paralyzed him when speed was the only metric that mattered. 40 seconds. That's all it had taken. 40 seconds and the entire architecture of his authority had developed a visible crack. 40 seconds and the invisible nurse had become something else entirely. But that wasn't the worst part for Whitfield. The worst part would come later, when Chen regained full consciousness and began asking questions about who had saved him. The worst part would come when a fully recovered Army Ranger, a man who understood the language of tactical decisions and professional competence, would start connecting the pieces of a puzzle that included a Kandahar vertical mattress and a pericardiocentesis performed with field hospital precision by someone whose name appeared on the nursing roster as unremarkable. For now, Brooke simply finished her work. She documented the procedure with clinical precision. She ensured Chen's vitals remained stable. She moved through the remainder of her shift with the same invisible grace that had defined her existence at St. Michael's, unaware that someone had just picked up a phone call that would eventually bring helicopters and questions and the slow, inevitable process of being buried a second time in the very place where she'd finally learned how to breathe. Within 6 hours of Brooke's hands pulling Chen back from the edge of death, Dr. Whitfield made his first phone call. He sat in his office on the 14th floor, the San Diego skyline bleeding orange behind him, and dialed the chief of medicine at Scripps Green. "I need to report a serious credentialing irregularity," he said, his voice steady as a surgeon's scalpel. "One of our nurses performed an invasive procedure, pericardiocentesis, without physician supervision. Scope of practice violation. Liability nightmare." The chief listened. Whitfield was careful with his words, painting Brooke as dangerously incompetent rather than dangerously competent. "The patient survived by luck, not skill. We need to document this before it happens again." The call lasted for minutes. 20 minutes later, he made the second call to a board member whose daughter had attended medical school on a Whitfield recommendation. "We have a credential fraud situation developing. I wanted to give you a heads up before HR gets involved." By Thursday morning, investigators from the state nursing board were calling her references. The woman who'd overseen Brooke's clinical rotations at UC San Diego received a call at 0830. "I'm looking into whether Ms. Sullivan received any unusual emergency training during her nursing program. Field medicine. Combat techniques. Anything outside standard protocols." The caller's name was filed under some generic regulatory office. The question was specific. Targeted. Someone had coached this investigator on exactly what to ask. Brooke's old clinical supervisor, a nurse named Richardson, felt something wrong in the tone of the question, the way it wasn't asking about competence, but about origin, but she had no context to challenge it. She was an excellent student. Technically superior. But no, nothing unusual. Why? The investigator thanked her and moved to the next reference. An external audit was ordered by Friday morning. Someone had already prepared the file request, all of Brooke's patient charts from the past 3 years. Every medication she'd administered. Every procedure note she'd documented. Every vital sign she'd recorded. The audit team received explicit instructions from someone on Whitfield's network: look for documentation errors. Medication discrepancies. Anything that suggests scope of practice violations. Be thorough. Audits typically took weeks. This one was expedited. This one had hunters inside it. By Thursday afternoon, HR called her into conference room B on the 3rd floor. The woman sitting across from Brooke was named Patricia Chen, no relation to the Ranger, and she had the exhausted look of someone who'd been handed a predetermined outcome and asked to deliver it professionally. "Brooke, we've received concerning documentation regarding your clinical credentials. Specifically, questions about your training and some unusual technical competencies outside standard nursing scope." Patricia slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed emails between State Board investigators and Dr. Whitfield, framing questions about Brooke's background in the language of regulatory concern. "Pending investigation into potential credentialing fraud and scope of practice violations, you're being placed on immediate administrative leave, effective immediately. Security will escort you out of the building. You're not to contact patients or access hospital systems." Brooke's hands were flat on the table. She didn't move them. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song. "Do you have any questions?" Patricia asked, her voice softer now, uncomfortable with the silence. "No," Brooke said. She walked to her locker in the staff room and pulled out her bag. The pair of worn combat boots were still inside, laced the way she'd left them 3 years ago, the leather creased with memory. She didn't take them. She left them there, like leaving evidence at a crime scene. 2 security guards, one named Marcus, who'd always nodded at her during late shifts, flanked her as she walked down the main corridor at 1820. Nurses she'd worked beside for 3 years watched in silence. Some looked confused. Some looked embarrassed. One looked relieved that it wasn't them. Dr. Whitfield stood in the physician's lounge doorway, watching her go, and the expression on his face was pure satisfaction. She could feel it burning into her back like a laser sight. The parking garage was empty at that hour, echoing with the sound of a single car door opening. Brooke sat behind the wheel of her 2009 Honda Civic. The battery had been dying for months, the engine requiring increasingly desperate turns of the ignition before it caught, and she couldn't turn the key. Her forehead pressed against the steering wheel, still warm from the afternoon heat trapped in the car. The silence inside was absolute. A silence that had no military designation, no operational structure, no purpose. She disappeared once before under orders. Marja Province, Helmand Region, 2011. A classified operation that officially never happened, her military record scrubbed from every accessible database, her existence reduced to a social security number and a warning stamped in classified briefing documents, never surface. The burial had been necessary. She understood the reasoning. Operational security. Plausible deniability. The protection of assets. She'd accepted the terms of her own erasure the way soldiers accepted all the unspoken costs of service, not without feeling them, but without the luxury of refusing them. But this erasure was different. This erasure wasn't protection. This was annihilation. She'd spent 3 years at St. Michael's learning how to exist in one timeline, the civilian one, where Brooke Sullivan was just a nurse, competent and careful and invisible. She'd filled that skin carefully, worn it like a uniform that fit. The humiliation from Whitfield had been manageable because it was the price of that identity. The disdain at the vending machine, the public questioning of her credentials, the threat of security escort, all of it was survivable because she had constructed a self that could survive it. Nurses absorbed disrespect the way armor absorbed impact. It was part of the job. But Whitfield had found the seam. By launching an investigation into her credentials, by triggering regulatory scrutiny, by bringing investigative eyes to bear on her background, he'd created a situation where her buried identity could surface. The pericardiocentesis had announced what she was to anyone watching. Chen's question had identified it. Whitfield's vindictive response was to pull the thread and see what unraveled. And what would unravel was everything: the classified operation in Marja, the designation they'd given her in debriefing documents, the 17 lives she'd saved under fire, the wounds that had earned her medals she couldn't display, the entire architecture of her previous existence. She would be buried twice. Once by the military, sealed in classified files. Once by this hospital, erased from the roster of nurses who'd ever worked there. Once in the past, once in the present. Once by necessity, once by spite. Once to protect herself, once because someone had decided she was a threat worth removing. Brooke sat in the darkness of that parking garage for 2 hours. Her hands remained on the steering wheel. She didn't cry. Her eyes remained dry as a surgical field. She didn't move. Her body remained locked in place like a machine in standby mode. She didn't breathe the way other people did. Her breathing was controlled, measured, a meditation technique learned in environments where panic was fatal. She breathed the way someone breathed who had already survived the worst thing that could happen to her. Which was not quite the same as breathing at all. The darkness of the garage surrounded her like water. The concrete smelled like oil and exhaust and time. A few parking lights flickered overhead, casting everything in the yellow-gray of sodium vapor, the kind of light that made the world look like an old photograph of itself. She thought about the combat boots in her locker. She thought about the folder from the military, the one containing her actual service record, still locked in a storage unit 15 minutes from here. She thought about what happened to people whose two selves collided like this, whose hidden life and visible life crashed into each other at high velocity. She thought about disappearing again. Not being buried by the system this time, but choosing the burial herself. Walking away from Brooke Sullivan, from St. Michael's, from San Diego. Getting into her car, if the battery would start, if the engine would turn over, and driving until that identity dissolved behind her like blood in salt water. There were places where a woman with her skills could work without documentation. There were organizations that didn't care about credentials because credentials were dangerous. There were ways to disappear that weren't classified, that were just voluntary. The kind of voluntary that came from inside, from knowing that existence itself had become unbearable. The thing was, she'd already done that once. She'd already walked away from everything. She'd already chosen obscurity. And for 3 years, she'd thought she'd succeeded. She'd thought she'd found a place where she could be ordinary. A place where no one asked questions. A place where being a nurse was enough. She'd been wrong. The Black Hawk descended through pre-dawn darkness like a thunderbird folding its wings, rotors screaming against the San Diego sky with a sound that made windows rattle 3 blocks away. It was 0600 on a Friday, and the aircraft touched down in the St. Michael's parking lot with the precision of something that had landed in worse places, Bagram, Kandahar, the roof of a forward operating base while rounds were still incoming. The rotors didn't slow. They kept spinning, a warning wrapped in noise. 2 Marines in dress blues walked through the ER entrance at 0605. Not hurried. Not uncertain. They moved with the kind of purpose that made people unconsciously step aside, the way water parts around stone. The first Marine, a gunnery sergeant with a scar that split his left eyebrow, approached the security desk with his hands empty and his shoulders back. "We're looking for Reaper," he said. "She here?" The security guard, Polk, the same man who'd escorted Brooke from the building 48 hours earlier, went rigid. His coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. His eyes widened for a single breath, then narrowed with understanding. When he stood, his posture shifted from civilian slouch to something military, something drilled into muscle memory decades ago. Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan is on the 4th floor, Polk said, his voice suddenly parade ground sharp, his words clipped and precise. Trauma unit. I'll take you up. The elevator climb took 90 seconds. The Marines didn't speak. Neither did Polk. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic, and when the doors opened on the 4th floor, the corridor smelled like it always did, antiseptic mixed with the ghost of blood, with something underneath that was neither medicine nor cleaning chemicals, but the accumulated weight of human suffering held at bay by protocol and competence and people who showed up for 12-hour shifts knowing they might not save everyone, but they'd try anyway. The three of them walked toward the trauma unit. Heads turned. A resident stopped mid-conversation. A surgical tech stepped back against the wall. They could feel it coming, the shift in air pressure that happens when authority enters a room, not hospital authority, not the kind that came from a nameplate or a position on the organizational chart, but the kind earned in places where authority meant the difference between coming home and not coming home. 3-star General Martin Reeves stood waiting at the nurse's station, his uniform pressed sharp enough to draw blood, his face carved from the same material as monuments. He'd brought 2 aides and a file thick enough to hold the weight of secrets. When he saw Brooke emerge from a patient room, his expression didn't change, but his hand opened a file folder with the kind of deliberate precision that said, "This is the moment. This is where everything inverts." Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, the general said. It wasn't a question. I need to read your actual record aloud. In front of witnesses. Brooke's eyes didn't waver. Her hands didn't move. She was wearing scrubs and her name badge, the one that said Brooke Sullivan, RN, and under that badge, under the careful construction of invisibility she'd built for 3 years, was a classification level that made most people in this room suddenly understand why a 3-star general was standing in a civilian hospital in San Diego reading from a file that was supposed to be buried. Bronze Star, the general said, his voice carrying through the corridor like a command. He paused. The file page turned. Dr. Whitfield emerged from the break room, coffee in hand, and froze mid-step. His face went white. His cup trembled. Silver Star. Another pause. Another page. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the heart monitor's distant beeping from behind closed doors. 2 purple hearts. The general's eyes lifted briefly from the document, and in that moment, every person watching understood that these were not ceremonial medals, these were the kind earned in firefights where the outcome was measured in bodies and the people who saved those bodies sometimes saved them while bleeding themselves. Navy Cross. The silence stretched. It filled the corridor like something living. 17 confirmed saves under fire. For tour extensions requested and approved. Congressional commendation sealed for national security. The general folded the document closed. It made a sound like a coffin lid. For the past 3 years, he continued, she's been working as a civilian nurse at this hospital. Nobody here knows. The military records were filed under a classification that requires Pentagon approval to access. And the reason I'm standing here right now is because Dr. Whitfield initiated a credentialing investigation that triggered a federal military audit, which turned into a very thorough examination of how this hospital's surgical program actually works. Every eye in the corridor turned toward Whitfield. He was still holding the coffee cup. It was dripping now, slow drops on the linoleum, dark brown pooling around his shoe. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. His jaw worked like a fish pulled from water, gasping at an element it didn't understand. The audit, the general continued, uncovered a pattern spanning for years. Falsified patient outcome reports. Medicare billing fraud involving procedures coded as emergencies that were not emergencies. Systematic alteration of complication records to hide post-operative infections resulting from shortcuts in sterile technique. Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan will be cleared of all credentialing violations within the hour. You, Dr. Whitfield, are under federal investigation for Medicare fraud, medical negligence, and falsification of medical records. Federal agents are in the hospital administrator's office right now, and they're waiting for you. 2 actual federal agents stepped out from the stairwell behind him. Not hospital security. Real federal agents, the kind that meant something had crossed from institutional politics into actual crime. Whitfield's attorney, he'd called an attorney at 0530 before the sun came up, because somewhere deep in his bones he'd known something was coming, was waiting in the administrator's office with his briefcase. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. By 0750, Whitfield was escorted out of the hospital, his credentials revoked pending criminal investigation, his hand shaking as he realized that the network he'd spent 20 years building was severing like a rope under a blade. The 2 board members he'd called in favors from immediately issued statements of distance. Both were now facing questions about oversight failures. Both understood that association with Medicare fraud was a career-ending liability. The external investigators he'd hired to find violations in Brooke's record, they'd found something instead, documentation of his own fraud, dating back for years, meticulously recorded in the hospital's own databases. Rather than be complicit in covering it up, they turned the evidence over to federal authorities within 3 hours. Their liability insurance depended on it. By Friday afternoon, Whitfield's wife filed for divorce. His country club membership was quietly terminated. The surgical practice that bore his name removed him from the partnership. The residents who'd laughed at his mockery of Brooke during grand rounds now avoided eye contact in hallways, understanding with the clarity that only comes from seeing institutional power collapse that they'd been laughing at a man who was already falling. His attorney told him the Medicare fraud alone carried a potential 20-year sentence. The medical board suspension was immediate and non-negotiable. The patients whose outcomes he'd falsified were being contacted. The surgeries he'd performed were being audited. The reputation he'd spent 2 decades constructing was collapsing in real time, and he watched it happen the same way people watch car wrecks, unable to look away, unable to stop the inevitable momentum of consequence. Within a week, his name appeared in legal documents. Within 2 weeks, the San Diego Union Tribune ran a story on federal fraud charges against a prominent cardiac surgeon. Within 6 months, someone spotted him at a community college in Cajon, teaching CPR recertification courses at $18 an hour, his hand shaking as he demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy, his voice hoarse from explaining basic concepts to bored undergraduates who didn't know his name, didn't know what he'd done, didn't know that the man showing them how to save a life had spent years destroying them. The investigation he'd launched to bury Brooke became the weapon that annihilated him. Every thread he'd pulled unraveled his own lies instead of hers. 6 months later, Brooke stood on the roof of St. Michael's in her old combat boots, the leather still cracked in patterns that matched sand and blood, patterns that no amount of cleaning could remove because they were tattooed into the material itself. The San Diego skyline stretched out before her, the bay visible to the west, another Black Hawk rising over the water on a training run, its rotors beating the air like a mechanical heartbeat. She was no longer invisible. Her record had been partially declassified. Her rank acknowledged. Her existence confirmed in documents that could be filed in regular archives instead of sealed vaults. The hospital had offered her a position as trauma coordinator with a formal apology from the board, but she'd turned it down. She was going back, not to the shadows, but to training the next generation of combat medics at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, teaching them the techniques that save lives when protocol isn't enough, when the textbook breaks, when you're holding someone's heart in your hands and the only thing between alive and dead is knowing exactly where to push. Chen sent her a message every week. A simple thank you that he said would never be enough. Polk saluted her every morning, and she'd started saluting back. She thought about Whitfield sometimes, about the man who'd tried to erase her because her competence threatened his mediocrity, and she felt nothing, not satisfaction, not pity, just the blank operational calm that kept her alive through 17 firefights and 2 erasures from the records that were supposed to define her. A young nurse approached her on the roof, nervous, asking if the stories were true. Brooke considered the question. She considered the boots on her feet. She considered the scars hidden under her sleeves, the muscle memory that had taken over during a crisis, the 40 seconds that had saved a man's life and destroyed another man's career simply by being excellent in a moment when excellence was what was required. True class is what you do when the lights go out, she said finally, and walked back inside. The lights went out for her twice. Once in Marja. Once in a hospital where competence was dangerous and visibility was a liability. Both times she'd kept working. Both times she'd kept saving lives. Both times she'd been excellent in the dark, and that, she decided as she descended the stairwell back toward the trauma unit, was more than enough. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We drop stories like this every week, and you don't want to miss the moments when quiet people change everything. Like this video, drop a comment telling us your story. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value? And share this with someone who needs to remember that real power isn't a title. Sometimes it's just knowing exactly what to do when everything is falling apart.